In this day and age, if you're a radiology training program and you're not providing some AI content to your trainees, we are significantly underpreparing them for the future to come, and we're doing them a disservice. Because there's a very real future, regardless of the practice setting that you're in, that AI will be impacting your practice as radiologists to some degree.
Welcome to the show. We're here because we're curious about medical imaging or have a hunger to learn more. What can we learn from each other, and how should we prepare to tackle the challenges ahead? I'm Chris St. John, and join me today as we rethink imaging, a podcast by Informatics. Today, I am joined by Dr. Ali Tejani, a neuroradiology fellow at UCSF whose work focuses on training and supporting the next generation of imaging professionals. Ali created the Imaging Informatics and Business Intelligence track during his residency at UT Southwestern, currently chairs SIMS Members and Training Committee, and co-directs the National Imaging Informatics course. He's published on AI literacy in radiology and the role of social media in medical education. And his passion for teaching goes back to medical school, where he won an Excellence in Tutoring Award. Today, we're going to talk about how radiologists learn, how continuing education may evolve, and what it means to prepare for the future. Ali, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And of course, always great to connect with others in our field and to talk more about the current and future status of radiology education.
Hell yeah. So can we just start with you a little bit? What drew you into radiology, and when did education itself become such a core component of your work?
Yeah. And so I wasn't always thinking about radiology. I was initially headed towards a life in neurology as a sports neurologist and headache medicine. Working with a lot of our teams, though, I started to find an inclination towards the imaging and found myself heading down to the reading room in our hospital to learn more about our patients' scans and what that means and how we can improve on the orders that we had asked for and all the indications. And of course, slowly you can imagine that led to me gravitating towards radiology to the point where after a couple of dedicated rotations, that was it. I knew that was home and that was where I needed to be. Combine that with, this is about 2019 at the time, and so we hadn't had the AI waves that we've had in the last 5 or 6 years. And so this is a time where there was quite a bit of advanced imaging still in terms of modalities, but I was lucky to be in a place where we did have some AI work locally that was implemented in our workflow at the time. And of course, as a medical student, even as a resident, that would be exciting, just thrilling to witness. And that drew me in. All that to say, that's how I found myself eventually in radiology, down this path of at the intersection of imaging, advanced technology, and AI, really, to where we are today now after many years of rapid growth of AI solutions and the way we think about AI and how we're seeing it, that seems to exponentially accelerate its pace, as we'll see here in the coming months too. So hopefully that kind of gives an idea of where I was initially as a med student to where I am today.
Yeah. And so, from journeying through med student to where you are now, when did you become so excited about educating others?
Chris, I think it's always kind of been there. Even in as early as could think about, my perspective was, if I could learn something well enough to be able to teach it to someone else, then I was content with my progress. And so it started off with that perspective when I was younger. But then as I started to take on these roles of educating others as a medical student, as a resident, I realized just the significant satisfaction that one can have from seeing another easily pick up that content, overcome the barriers to learning a certain information, to understanding a concept that maybe we struggle with ourselves. And so, though initially it started off as a journey of self-improvement and trying to master content myself, it turned into quickly a desire to help others overcome the challenges that I personally had faced in my education. And the same thing goes for AI education. In that time period when I was first encountering radiology, I wanted to learn more about AI. There wasn't much out there, though, aside from a few resources, especially in terms of formal curricula that could be used locally to educate those who wanted to learn more. And so there was a process of exploration of trial and error that did take quite a bit of time and quite a bit of resources on my personal end. And at the end of the day, I started to realize there were some things that were really helpful and some things that weren't so helpful. And we didn't want others to have to go through that entire process to rework the wheel. And so the AI education perspective became, let's consolidate this information to present the highest yield content to trainees. And following that, multiple iterations later, we had curricula, we had tracks, and to the point where I'm very fortunate and happy to say that we've refined on the current AI education that's available now. And again, it's not just an individual effort. It's the resources, the collaborations with multiple large organizations, with numerous individuals that I won't be able to name all off the top of my head here, but just a really fantastic collaboration over the years for that goal. Yeah, and it's interesting because you don't realize it in the moment when you're teaching or learning and pursuing those interests. But in retrospect, thinking about it, we've talked, Chris, a little bit in the background about growing up in a household where I did have educators as parents and seeing them kind of work in that field. And then finding myself in a position to where if I initially, as a young trainee, as a student, if I could learn a concept and then if I could teach it really well to someone else, I felt comfortable knowing that I had done my best to really master a topic. And so initially, it started off with that self-growth perspective and as a way to really check myself and make sure I knew what I was talking about. But then as I got older and I found myself mentoring and teaching more, you find this really profound sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in seeing others overcome the barriers that you faced when trying to learn something. And so since then, it's become a drive to really help make it easy for others to learn things without facing the same challenges or same barriers that I did, to help it be more efficient because I know that they will find that same satisfaction that I did and they will pass it on to the next generation. And that will become a beautiful cycle that continues. And so maybe that's too idealistic, but I think that's the drive now and really continues to be the drive going forward.
Let's move on. So during your residency, I think it was during your residency, right? You launched the Imaging Informatics and Business Intelligence track, yeah?
I would say a group of us. I would hate to say that I did because there was so much support from our program director, our vice chair of informatics, and all the others who contributed resources and content and time. But yes, we set that up during residency, actually when I was an intern and just coming into my radiology residency there.
What was the idea behind the track? What was the problem y'all were trying to solve? Who were some of those other key players that we can maybe tip our hat to?
Absolutely. And so as we kind of talked about, that was around the time that I was pursuing this self-inspired journey of learning about AI, just to be someone who could practice radiology and still speak competently about artificial intelligence, which at the time was starting to really pick up. And as I went to my program director and the vice chair of informatics, I made this pitch and said, hey, I have found myself just deeply immersed in this journey. And there are a lot of insights here, and nothing would make me happier than to share those insights and see how it could benefit others and really help streamline the process of learning about this very important technology that would affect all of us. And as we can see, it is affecting all of us. And so that was the motivation. And of course, I think a lot of it is just having the right mentors, right? And so this resonated with both of them, and they were, again, very selfless. Probably that's the theme, and hopefully something I can incorporate in my future as a mentor in coming years. And they're very selfless with their time and resources and helping clear the road of any barriers to setting this up. But what was important was they were able to guide us through formalizing this and making sure that this was not just a experience that lasted for a few times or one or two times, but something that really was longitudinal and reproducible and robust that would last sustainably over many years. And so when we set that up, we had the first iteration roll out with a pilot year that started with both content that was built directly into the radiology residency curriculum once a month, and then due to demand and popularity twice a month, which again is a lot thinking about how much you already have to learn in radiology, and finding the time to include that content can be tough. And so I think it says a lot about trainee demand that we were asked to present more and more and had to, really find places to present that in the curriculum. But then there was advanced content that we presented to a select group of students or trainees who had expressed interest through an advanced track that would meet after hours once or twice a month, depending on what's going on in the schedule. And there we'd have small focused discussions. For example, when we were working with large language models for quite some time, but then when ChatGPT became really big news in 2022, that month we had a focused small group on how can large language models affect radiology. And many of the use cases that we see now in the journals and in the vendor field, in the vendor world, and papers, they were brought up by the trainees at the front lines who saw the use cases and saw the value. and saw this future to where large language models would really fundamentally affect the way we practice radiology. And now, of course, then that happened for Gen AI. And then we also looked into more advanced topics like bias and the clinical deployment and AI monitoring side of things, and really set, I think, a beautiful stage for our radiology trainees who had this interest to leave when they graduate, not just with that core fundamental clinical knowledge to be excellent clinicians, but to also be the leaders when it comes to stakeholders and stewards for proper, effective, ethical use of AI in practice.
Yeah. So I've got, I don't know, is it a spicy question? Maybe it's not a spicy question, but you're talking about your mentors, you're talking about younger folks. I feel like there's a lot of cultural conversation going on right now about generations and generations, like different learning habits, different learning styles. Folks like myself who, like, I kind of bridged the gap, right? I didn't grow up with unlimited computer access, but I was taking typing classes in school. And you've worked with younger trainees. How do you think their learning preferences differ from past generations of radiologists?
It's a really interesting question. I think it's an important one. When I think of my role, at least to your question, I realize that I'm in a bit of an odd position to where I'm almost like this avatar, this bridge between
Yeah.
generations as an advocate, as an AI advocate, just being
Right.
fundamentally at that role because you have to interact with groups who've been practicing radiology for decades, longer than I was born around before I was born, right?
Hmm.
Those who really established our field. And then you have this other group of really energetic, excited. Both groups are innovative, but there's a different kind of innovation that comes from a group that's at the front lines, the way our trainees are, who want to change the field and they want to adapt it to new trends. And so I see myself in this not neutral position, but in a position to where it's really important to understand how do we set up our practice to where we can educate those older generations of radiologists on the new technology while still, and then address the desires of not just educating the younger generations, but really helping them appropriately integrate this this technology that they want to see in their future practice and things that they will eventually will become the status quo for them
Right.
with the next right technology to follow to where it kind of goes down that pipeline and they become that older generation. But it's interesting because I think that there's a desire. There's oftentimes I see a more of a early adopter mentality in that younger generation to where change
Hmm.
management becomes a really big conversation for some of our older generations because fundamentally introducing this technology does change the way we practice, even if just a little bit in terms of a single workflow piece. But that being said, there's no black and white in radiology, right? There's this gray area to where you have many early adopters and innovators that I have been inspired by and I look up to, right?
Right.
And I continuously learn from them. So and again, others who are a little more content in the younger generations and not necessarily being early adopters and kind of going with the flow in that sense. So I say this in not to draw broad strokes or to generalize too much, but to acknowledge that I think when you step back, there are some if you're going to be someone who's an advocate for AI and AI education, it really is important to understand the different perspectives so that you can, at the end of the day, honestly tailor information to be effective, right? Because one educational strategy or one integration strategy for a certain group of radiologists may not be as effective for the other, right? Same thing goes across generations of radiologists as well, I think.
Do you see the younger generations gravitating towards other forms of content for their education? I say this as somebody who is, it's meta. We are proactively recording a radiology podcast about radiology education in the hopes of educating people about radiology education. Do you see folks gravitating towards, more digital content, podcasts, social media, videos over traditional lectures and journals? Is it a blend? Obviously nothing's a monolith, but
Of course, and to that point, it's yes is the short answer.
yeah.
I think that there is a generational shift away from your traditional didactics. It'd be very hard to have to use your words, a monolithic curriculum that only has traditional didactics.
Hmm.
Attend a lecture, take notes, take a test. Attend a lecture, take notes, take a test. I don't think it's going to work anymore. I think what's happening now is, and even when I was a medical student, right? Many individuals would opt for the virtual option for watching lectures and they would watch it at double the speed because it was more efficient that way. And that would
Oh
then
yeah.
open up time for them to learn from more interactive ways that were personalized and tailored to the way that they learn. So I think that's the key is there's a shift to more personalized education. What works for me may not be the most effective for the next person. If someone
Hmm.
else likes to do flashcards, that doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to be a flashcard user. But what I'm seeing as a general trend is more digital content that's consumable. So small segments, not 2-hour lectures all in one sitting, right?
Hmm.
And targeted and interactive. People want to have something that breaks up the monotony of just sitting and listening to someone else talk, I think. And so part of the I know we mentioned the National Imaging Informatics course, which is why I do want to talk about it because I think
Yeah.
that it's such a fantastic way to manifest a lot of these acknowledgments because we have flipped classroom sessions, we have workshops, we have interactive sessions, and we still have some traditional didactics because that acknowledges that at the end of the day, the group of learners is diverse, and that hybrid method does cater to everyone without singling out or excluding certain groups. And I think that's what we're seeing is a need to address this diverse learner population. And so the groups that succeed, I think, are those that acknowledge it, but they also act on it, right? So if you update your virtual platforms, your LMS, et cetera, to have this hybrid content, I think that's the way to go. And
Yeah.
podcasts are great too. I say that as a podcast host myself, and it's a
Yeah.
lot of bites. I acknowledge that, but I think that especially if you are at the end of the day and you don't want to necessarily your eyes are strained as a radiologist, you just want to pop your headphones in and listen to an interesting conversation. This is the way to go, and it can be educational. People have tried that for even for board exam studying. If you go out there are podcasts to study for your board exams.
Can you tell us some of the trends that you're seeing in the National Imaging Informatics course with like a bit more granularity?
Of course, for sure, and I think that there's a long conversation to be had. We could probably talk about that fantastic course for another hour or so. The broad trends I will say is similar increasing trainee demand for AI and imaging informatics content, even earlier in the PGY years for residency, which I think is exciting and it ensures a really good future for our field because that means we have learners who want to absorb that information early and build on it over the course of their career. In terms of speaking to the way and the methods of learning that you were asking about, I think it's similar in that we have busy schedules, especially as medical trainees and residents. And so the course acknowledges that. It doesn't force you to be in person. It highly encourages it because that's the way to meet our fantastic expert speakers and to meet our team at SIM and RSNA. But it acknowledges that life's busy. And so there are asynchronous ways to watch the videos and catch up and go through not 50 questions at the end of the lecture, but 3 or 4 questions that really emphasize the key take home points from each lesson. And so again, various ways of interacting with the content when you're even if you're not there in person. And then the flipped classroom method has been really popular. So watching a video that's condensed or is consolidated the night before, and then having a discussion with the speaker on it for those rich conversations and follow-up questions that often we can't get into at the end of a talk due to time restraints. So that's a really popular method as well. But also workshops, actual demos, and having experts walk us through creating AI models, creating informatics projects, or going through their Google Colab books or having prompt engineering workshops and such has been well received, I think. But I think that's the lesson there is just is embracing that hybrid approach.
And speaking of my own experience in the non-medical education system, at college, the majority of my classes were split into like 3 lectures a week and 1 precept, where, the lecture, you're in a room with 200 people, the precept, you're in a room with 10 and maybe a grad student, and you're actually engaging with the material rather than just being spoken to. I mean, and I can say for myself, like sitting in a room listening to someone talk at me for an hour, I never, I never engaged with it ever, ever, ever. Like I just didn't, it wasn't my learning style. It did not resonate for me. I would love, get me arguing in precept and I would be there and I would be loving it. But if you're just going to talk at me, for me, it doesn't work. It's cool to hear about making these approaches more varied and more engaging for folks.
Yeah, I think about even in residency when I was one of the chief residents at our program, and one of the conversations we would have with our program director and associate program directors is how do we update the content in the curriculum to really resonate? with our trainees. And the most popular, by far the most popular, at least when I was there and to my knowledge, form of conveying the information were case sessions, to where the trainees had seen lectures on bowel pathologies, on brain pathologies, on spine pathologies, etc. But now you're looking at this dedicated session, just running through cases to where you're applying that information. And
Mhm.
traditionally, it's interesting because if you ask generations of radiologists, they'll talk about this hot seat conference, to where it's a little stressful. You're feeling the pressure. I don't think that's the way to go, and I don't think current generations want that. And I can tell you that's just not going to work. And that's a hot take because I know that's going to disagree with several generations of radiologists. But what I think is important is acknowledging that there was value in that case session, but having that collaborative, safe space to make mistakes. It's okay to be wrong. That's why we're in training. But it often gets lost when you're in that stress situation, thinking you have to impress, you have to know it. And what I tell our trainees is, if you knew the answer, you wouldn't be in residency, right? Because you wouldn't be in a position to learn. You came here with very little information about radiology, with a goal for the program, the mandate of the program, to teach you and make you the best radiologist that they can. And so I think the generational shift that we're seeing there is sessions like we had in my residency, to where it was okay to be wrong, and that made it really comfortable and fun to take those cases. Instead of having people shy away, people would say, "I'm okay taking this because I know that just like that other person can get things wrong, I can get things wrong." And it gets even better when the attending says, "I used to make mistakes. It's okay. Let's normalize making mistakes so that we can learn from them and not make them when we're actually at the workstation," right? And so I think that's another really important nuance in radiology education that often may not be acknowledged. I know it's a hot take, and I know I'm interested. I'm expecting people to say, "Oh, he was challenging the way things are." But I think it's important to emphasize that I've seen it work. I've seen it work, and I think it's the way to go.
Oh, absolutely. So number one, challenging things. Yes, please. That's why we're here. We're here to have interesting conversations on this show. We're here to challenge the status quo and talk about different perspectives. But no, I was just speaking to David Larson, a professor at Stanford, who is this massive advocate for peer learning rather than the traditional scored peer review process, not even among like residents, but among actively practicing radiologists, folks who have been in the field for 15, 20 years. He's really making this push to get away from the traditional scored learning systems and to create these exact environments that you're talking about. And so it's exciting to hear that it's happening at all levels. And, we're really starting to push this more progressive approach through. That's, it's going to yield better results for patients. It is.
Absolutely. No, and it takes away that fear and that intimidation that's associated with the older formats. And it lets you have that relaxed concentration so that you can understand the gaps that you have in your knowledge and then take away what you need to learn or study from that session, versus having the feelings of, "Oh, I can't believe I got that wrong. I embarrassed myself." It takes the focus away from those really negative self-critical feelings that are counterintuitive, and lets the trainee focus on, "This is what I have to do to be a better radiologist. And this is the goal that I know I have for myself to study before the next session." And so I think it's counterintuitive to not do it that way, right? And it's just tough because I think as generations of educators progress, they think about the way they were taught, and it's hard to think outside the box when you did something, you've got pressures from clinical work, from administrative work, from other things. There's not much time left to dedicate mental power and resources to innovating the way we teach. And so we do the same thing over and over again. But I think it does take an intentional effort to change things, and it takes the right people in the right positions to institute those changes.
Can you tell me, I believe you've published a little bit and written a lot on how social media can be used in radiology education. I'm curious, as someone like myself, I am a little skeptical and a little bit afraid when it comes to social media in general. I'm largely non-participatory outside of this show itself, but I want to hear about some of the good that's coming from it that you've seen.
And that's a really important point to bring back to our earlier conversation about differences in generations for how we consume information and want our education. I found myself in this gray zone to where I'm not as adept as younger generations with social media, but I grew up in a generation that was introduced to social media. I think the earliest forms of social media kind of came out when I was growing up.
Right.
And I've seen it both as a user and as an observer more in my later years, seeing how it evolves and how people interact with it. And we know that there are dangers and negative sides to social media. That's been well elaborated and well enumerated.
Right.
But there are definitely some positives and some really great ways to use or leverage this tool for good and for education. I mean, if you take a look, when we talked about podcasts and digital content and small short snippets, some of the most effective educational approaches have been social media driven initiatives to where people present focused content, visual content for those visual learners that emphasizes a key point. I won't name any big influencers to maintain that conflict of interest. But there are, if you go to Instagram, to back when it was Twitter and now I guess X and then Blue Sky, you have really fantastic content. If you type in radiology or radiology education, and people who found this niche for themselves to where they develop these beautiful graphics that are focused, that really address things that are hard to learn about in just a conference or when someone's explaining it to you by just talking about it. And the positive feedback has been that their followers have exponentially increased. And you know that they're doing something right if that's the case. And so I highly encourage people listening to this to go find those posts, because I personally started getting back into social media for that purpose, to learn, to be honest with you. If all those channels, those posts, it's a quick read while you're eating breakfast or you're on the commute to work, or just at the end of the day, you want to learn, but you don't have the energy to watch a video or read a book or read a chapter. And then inspired by this, I've tried my own kind of foray into Instagram and social media to try and share resources again, and create these kind of focused libraries or these focused collections of information that meets users where they are, right? So we know that the younger generations are on these platforms. And so there are ways to deliver information to them there where they can use it, where they're comfortable and they can personalize it to their needs. And so I think that the feedback there has been really positive so far. And I think that's a really important landscape for educators to tap into in the coming years, is how much can we engage with the future generation and current trainees through those platforms. And it does take a bit of learning. There's a bit of a learning curve to understand how to really use these effectively, because there's a way to use it to where it doesn't work at all, and you won't be heard, your content won't be out there, won't get to the right people. But so it does take some time to learn about how to use these tools effectively.
I'm curious, what has your experience been when trying to connect and engage with folks on social media, in terms of like, I make jokes about, our overlord, the algorithm, but what has your experience been like navigating the sea of algorithmic approval and trying to both find educational content yourself that is relevant, but also to share and pass things along?
I haven't figured it out yet. That's the
right. Neither have I.
continuous learning process. And that's what keeps it fun, is that you're continuously trying things and learning. But I think knowing the right hashtags, it sounds silly, I feel weird saying it, but just knowing the right hashtags and kind of knowing that it's okay to experiment with a few and see if it reaches a certain audience, right? You want to make it relevant. There's a way to broaden your scope, to narrow your scope. If you're sharing content, I like to really acknowledge that the people who create the resources, so authors, and so by tagging them, you can kind of engage with their audience and their fan base, if you will. And so there are ways, I think, that you can kind of use the nuances in those situations to expand your scope. And I don't know how much of that's the algorithm or how much of that is just luck, but
Right.
it's a fun process. It kind of keeps it going. And honestly, through that, you meet new people, you collaborate, you network, and you learn yourself and you grow your horizons. So I think it's been an overall positive experience. But that being said, it has to be an intentional process again as well.
Right. We have all this educational content out there, right? We have this podcast, we have TikTok clips, we have, Instagram infographics, which is largely can be providing very helpful and sometimes very accurate information. When trying to decipher truth from fiction in these spaces, do you have any advice, especially when it comes to, higher level educational content?
That's the risk. That's the hard part, because as someone who if I'm searching for educational content, there's an assumption that I don't have prior experience to the point where I could vet what's real, what's not real, what's accurate, what's not accurate. I think that's the risk, is trying to is seeing something that's a post that looks legitimate and taking it for legitimate when it may not be. And I think the key there is to try and limit if you're the user or the trainee, is trying to look for those trusted individuals, the people that are the experts or have shown that they know something about this content, to where you can trust it. That being said, things are always changing with AI generated content. It's really hard to tell unless you have an expert with you. I don't have the best advice other than just following not just a gut feeling, but really going with the people that are verified. Maybe they're sponsored by certain organizations. Maybe you've seen them at conferences give talks. I would say start there and take anything else with a grain of salt. Don't necessarily just use that as your ground, as your reference standard, your ground truth. Yeah.
Yeah. And then my last follow-up with all the social media stuff is, we have these more rigorous structures for CME, which involve, engaging with the content and taking a little quiz, getting your credits. Do you see paths forward for these new social media and web-based learning methods to potentially start to fill in those gaps or be able to give people those credits themselves?
And I think that's a complex area too. I don't know off the top of my head the role of social media there, but I do think that the traditional method of answering a couple of questions, multiple choice questions, is getting old and stale. I think people want more interactive content. They want to have information they can click on, they can engage with. Maybe it's still a problem based format, but more identify where the abnormal finding is, or something similar to that nature. But I do think that CME is changing, and it's changing towards being more interactive, and always, of course, being efficient and not taking up too much time. I think that that's kind of the secret sauce there. On social media, that's an interesting question. I think we've seen groups post CME content as a way to show a preview of what they have to offer. I think that could be one interesting way is, hey, we offer CME and this is what it kind of looks like. And if we invite you to come see more, that's one way to do it. Otherwise, I think same thing if you're having a CME session or you want to invite individuals to attend and come out to this conference, posting clips, right? Little bite-sized previews of what they can expect to let them make a more informed decision. Again, it's knowing where your attendees and your consumers are and helping them make informed decisions. So I think there really is a process that is well-intentioned there that's going to change too. I don't think CMEs will stay static, and the ones that do, I don't think will be used as often unless there's some other really significant benefit that they offer over other platforms.
So, we've been talking for a minute now. I know you have a lot of background with AI. We got to touch on it. So, high level, from your perspective, what do radiologists right now really need to know about AI? Big question.
That's a really tough question.
Real big.
Because I think it depends on what your role will be. One thing I will say, and again, in keeping with the trend of hot takes on this conversation, this may draw different responses from who's listening, depending on what their personal beliefs are. But I'll tell you mine, and I think
they can come on the show and rebuttal you if they'd like.
I welcome that. I think that's how we find progress, is having those conversations. But I do think, and this is all informed from my perspective as a trainee, talking to other trainees and various different experiences. In this day and age, if you're a radiology training program and you're not providing some AI content to your trainees, we are significantly underpreparing them for the future to come, and we're doing them a disservice. Because there's a very real future, regardless of the practice setting that you're in, that AI will be impacting your practice as a radiologist to some degree. Yeah. It's going to vary depending on the practice context. Some places may have more, some may have less, but it's not like the prior generations where you have plenty of time to have this learning curve and to learn. It's going to be that you graduate from residency or your fellowship and you're really thrown into a practice where AI is in your workflow. And if you haven't had experience with, you don't have to know how AI solutions are developed. You don't have to know how to code. You don't have to know the mathematics behind it. You have to know how to use it effectively, when it's wrong, what the pitfalls are. And so if you ask me what every radiologist needs to know, is how to be an effective user, how to be an informed user and a critical user. Those are the keys, because the radiologist using AI won't be tripped up by, oh, well, is this a CNN or is this a large language model? Is this Gen AI? What is Gen AI? No. That's not going to be the question at the forefront when you're using AI models. It's going to be, is this supposed to be a really sensitive tool? Am I supposed to use this to find something or just to know that something's wrong? What's the risk of me agreeing with something that's wrong here? Our automation bias is these concepts that need to be introduced so that when you're using the solution, you're an effective user. It's like going through residency without ever having a hands-on ultrasound course, right? You can interpret ultrasound all you want, but it really clicks when you're the operator with your hands on the ultrasound probe, scanning the organs, because then you know the orientation, you know how to adjust the settings to get the optimal pictures. If you're doing procedures, you know how to use it in a more advanced way. AI is the same. You don't have to know you learn the physics. And don't get me wrong, all trainees should learn physics and behind the modalities. And that's the parallel for knowing how AI works is if you know the physics behind modalities, you probably need to know a little bit about how AI models work and how they're developed. But when it comes to being a functional user, that information is not as important as where are the pitfalls and where will I get tripped up trying to interpret images in the context of having AI either recreate them, provide segmentations, provide some sort of insight, or disrupt the workflow and make it harder for me to use counterintuitively make it harder to be a radiologist and add more time to the workflow if you don't know how to use it effectively. And so I think to answer your question, what do all radiologists need to know is just how to be a good user, an informed, ethical user.
Yeah. I mean, so when you're training and teaching folks how to engage with this technology, there has to be some sort of balance, right? About when it's coming into the picture, right? I use ChatGPT and Claude, to iterate my copywriting a bunch, right? Shifting tones, tightening things up. And even over the course of just a couple of years, like I have found myself needing to remind myself, no, we're not going to plug it into a large language model right now. We're just going to write this email by hand and we're going to edit it by hand and we're going to keep those core skills competent, right? So when introducing AI to folks, when and how do you introduce it so as not to risk de-skilling?
That's a really good question. I think really timely because that's actually the exact discussion happening right now. And so I will preface that uh, a lot of this content will depend on who is in charge of AI trainee education. There will be different beliefs, there'll be different approaches. There's no one size fits all. And I think that that's actually why we're having discussion now is because you have educators trying to grasp best practices for this very same situation. And I will acknowledge one of my mentors, Dr. Tessa Cook from Penn, who is very gracious, selfless educator. And I don't know how she does it all, but she does it all. And I highly encourage anyone listening to follow her on social media to learn all about not just this content area, but others. But conversations that she and I have had have addressed some of these considerations, right? And so let's say you introduce AI as in the first year of medical training or in residency. Well, then you have the risk of potentially becoming too dependent on AI to where it becomes part of your search pattern for looking at a case, or it becomes tough to practice without AI when you go into the world, right? We talked about a future where AI will touch radiologist workflow in some form or fashion, guaranteed. But like we said, it's not going to be the same across all practices. You may be in a place that doesn't have the same resources as a larger academic or private practice institution, and they may not have as much AI. But if you've only practiced learning how to use AI in your workflow, all of a sudden you'll find yourself like a fish out of water. You're not going to know what to do. And if you do, you may not be as comfortable and that may lead to mistakes and other issues that make you a less than optimal radiologist. The flip side, though, is again what we talked about: is if you wait too long to introduce AI in the training curricula, there may not be enough time to cover the essentials to make sure that they are effective users this technology in their practice. And so there's the balance there, right? I will say that I think this is going to evolve, right? As we start to get more and more AI at academic programs and training programs. I will say though, if there are groups that are and this is what we did, and so maybe that's the bias I have to acknowledge, is that if you're introducing AI early in your training, you have to be very intentional about it and have very clear upfront conversations with trainees saying, hey, the fact that you're using AI at this stage is not common, it's unique, it's new, and here's how your framework should be when approaching AI, right? When you're opening a case, don't just run to the AI solution results showing the positive or negative intracranial hemorrhage results, right? Go through the images yourself, look for the finding, learn to find that yourself or find the absence of that finding yourself, and then confirm it with the AI results. And then you can have lectures and sessions to where you review AI results and kind of take a look at how the model's performing. And then you can have orientations. And this is what we did. We had an orientation where we went through, these are all the models that are deployed. Here's how we encourage you to use it. As a trainee, here's your responsibility to make sure that you can become the best radiologist that isn't dependent on AI, but knows when to use it and how to use it well. So I think it's going to scale across the enterprise. We're going to have AI, and it's going to be hard not to have trainee interaction early on. But when you have that, acknowledging it and being really ahead of the game and being on top of it before realizing that trainees become dependent on AI is really important.
So, Ali, I mean, you brought us a lot of food for thought today, but finally, just for the residents and for fellows listening, what advice would you give, just about staying curious, staying engaged, and maybe if someone is interested in getting more into educating themselves?
Stay hungry. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's the headline. I think is always be curious. Is always kind of push yourself, and even if it's uncomfortable and it's something new, find that nice balance between challenging yourself to learn about this content, and don't be afraid to reach out to others. You'll find that those working in the AI space are very friendly and know that what it's like to be a trainee who wants to learn more. And so the best thing we can do is just help the next generation. And so please reach out to us. Then the other thing is take advantage of all the resources out there. So if you go to the big organizations, right? If you go to RSNA, ASIM, ACR, and others, you'll find that there's a lot of content that's made free to trainees because that's the goal, is to educate trainees. And if there's something that's not provided, advocate for it. So if you want to be a member of the National Imaging Informatics course, take that to your program director and show them the value and talk to them and connect them to us. And we can help talk about why we think it's a great idea as well. And so there are ways to really advocate for resources, to use the resources out there. If you want to find more open source content, reach out to me. We built this list of kind of graded material that's foundational level, a little more advanced. It tells you kind of what's paid for, what's free, what you can audit, and it provides just a way. It really is a culmination of not just mine, but multiple people's experiences with self-directed learning to addressing local shortcomings or limitations in AI education. And so there's that. There's multiple programs that started to release their own tracks. So if you're a medical student and you're applying for residencies listening to this, ask about AI education. Ask, how are you educating the next generation of radiologists with AI? Are you using AI? If not, why not, right? When I was helping with interviews, I think when I was helping with interviews for residencies, that was one of the questions that I noticed year on year became really pertinent and common was, what is the interaction, the degree of interaction with AI? And so I think people want this. Trainees want this. Programs have to meet them where they are. So 2 calls to action. If you're a trainee, go use these resources and don't be afraid to reach out. But if you're an educator, push the mold. Don't become complacent and comfortable with the way we've taught AI education and the way we've taught radiology education. Understand really where your trainees are and try to meet that demand the best that you can and advocate for them, because that's what educators do. We advocate for the next generation. And just one last thing, when we think about getting our AI education set up, let's tie those concepts from earlier in the talk with the content we just talked about. Let's not just revert to traditional didactics, because I think if you try to just teach about AI, it's not going to be as effective as guidance while using AI. So get AI in the hands of trainees in a controlled environment. You can have sandboxes, playgrounds where they can interact with different tools and kind of see what works well, what doesn't work well. And you may note that there's more effective learning and more sustainable learning that takes place in that context than if you're simply talking at a crowd about a tool and showing pictures of it. You have to let the trainees experience it. You have to let them walk through the pitfalls in a controlled environment that's not going to impact patient care, so that when they're in the moment where it matters, when they're in that seat at the workstation and they have an AI result, they know exactly what to do with it. So my challenge is to get AI in the hands of trainees in a controlled environment as soon as we can.
Where can folks find you if they're interested? And is there anything that you'd like to plug?
You can find me on Instagram. You can find me on Blue Sky, or you can find me at my email address. I'm LinkedIn too. So a couple of different social media platforms, but always looking at the traditional ways of reaching out to me as well. Happy to engage with our trainees.
Beautifully said. Ali, thank you so much for joining us today on Rethink Imaging. It's been a total pleasure talking to you, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Likewise, thank you so much for this kind invitation and for bringing attention to what I think is a really important topic.
Frame by Frame Rethink Imaging is brought to you by Informatics. Here, you'll find engaging interviews with thought leaders, experts, and patients, sharing stories that showcase the transformative power of medical imaging. To discover how Informatics is rethinking imaging in healthcare, visit Informatics.com. Be sure to subscribe to Frame by Frame Rethink Imaging on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And from all of us here at Informatics, thanks for tuning in.